Good afternoon and good evening, depends on where you are. Thank you for joining the third panel of this year's Stable Global Network Conference. And in this panel, we're going to deal with a very controversial and emerging issue in terms of the current trends of green transition. So this panel, we're going to talk about some confrontations, competitions, or disruptions coming from the growing race for industry policy in the green transition. We have 4 distinguished speakers. I won't actually give a detailed introduction to each of them. None of them needs a detailed introduction, and we do have a more detailed bios for each speaker in the events pack. So please refer to the events pack for the bios. For this panel, we have 2 topics which provides a broader overview and discussion of the ongoing trend of green transition and the industry policies involved and their implications. And then we have 2 more specific presentations on topics in relation to critical minerals and the global biodiversity framework. I will give a very brief introduction to each speaker before they speaks. But now let me move on to the first speaker. Our first speaker is Assistant Professor Mandy Fang, and she is an assistant professor at the City University of Hong Kong School of Law. Her research interests focus on the interface between international trade, environmental protection, and energy transition. And she has published in many leading journals in this field. She will be talking about revisiting green industry policy in an era of disruption. Mandy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wei Huan, for your very kind introduction. I'm very delighted to be here to share with you one of my recent papers analyzing green industrial policies. So, as you can see, I made a very minor change to the title of my presentation, Revisiting Green Industrial Policy. I wrote this paper against the background of a resurgence of interest among an increasing number of countries, particularly those with large economies, in using green industrial policy in a wide range of clean technologies that are absolutely essential for decarbonization. Next slide, please, Hannah. In this paper and also in today's presentation, I would like to raise and address a few questions that make up the outline of my paper. And those questions are: first, what is the context in which the recent wave of green industrial policy has unfolded? Second, how has green industrial policy been designed and implemented in this new era? And last, I will look at what are the implications of this recent wave of green industrial policy. In the interest of time, I will not get into the detail of the context, which I depict as a new era with heightened geopolitical and geoeconomic tensions and a looming climate threat. Now I will move to the core subject, which is green industrial policy. Next slide, please. So green industrial policy is a terminology that is often interpreted differently depending on the audience, and which explains why we actually don't have a universally agreed definition. I would like to borrow one from 2 very prominent economists. In their definition, green industrial policy refers to any government measure aimed to accelerate the structural transformation toward a low carbon and resource efficient economy in ways that are also enable productivity enhancements in the economy. As you can see, this definition is quite broad. In my paper, I narrow green industrial policy to those that target at clean technologies, such as solar, wind, power batteries, and electric vehicles. Regarding the form of green industrial policy, there is really no one-size-fits-all, because in fact, green industrial policies can take a wide range of forms that go beyond single policy domains. Policy measures such as investments, fiscal incentives, regulatory measures, and policy support are designed to facilitate the deployment and development of green technologies across the value chain can qualify as green industrial policies. So this new era I earlier very briefly depicted has experienced an increasing use of green industrial policies, but those with, and also especially those with multiple objectives, such as the objective to achieve economic growth, social development, enhance national security, to compete geoeconomically, to compete geopolitically, and also to achieve environmental goals. So in this paper, I conceptualize multi-purpose green industrial policy and use this as an analytic framework to capture the evolution of green industrial policies in this new era. And in order to better illustrate this trend, I would like to use China, the United States, and the European Union as examples due to their heavyweight in this area, and also their economic cloud, and also the use of industrial policies by those three largest economies. So next slide, please. I would like to look at the evolution of green industrial policies in China. As all of you know, China has followed a socialist market economy model, or the so-called national state capitalism, by actively pursuing a mix of industrial policies in almost all of its economic sectors, including the clean energy sector. Although China's early stage of clean energy development was primarily for energy security, for poverty alleviation, with little or even no industrial objective, the country has substantially boosted its industrial ambition in the clean energy sector since the mid to late 2000s by deploying a robust set of green industrial policies in sectors like wind and solar technologies at the beginning, and then later covering also power batteries and electric vehicles. So China's active use of the green industrial policies has substantially boosted its manufacturing and exportation capacity. However, it came with a price, which made China very vulnerable to external restrictions. Therefore, against the background of a deteriorating relationship between China and Western economies, China has recently redesigned and shifted its development strategy by introducing the so-called dual circulation with a focus on developing its own domestic market and reduce the dependency on foreign markets, overseas markets. So industrial policies are expected to also be directed to support domestic deployment of clean technologies in the downstream sector and also in the upstream R&D in order to reduce the dependency on foreign technologies. However, now it remains too early to tell whether China's shift of its green industrial policy will yield substantial effects. I guess we still need to wait and see how the new development strategy of the dual circulation be implemented and the effectiveness of that. Next slide, please. After China, now I would like to walk you through the US evolution of green industrial policies. So for a long time, the US green industrial policies have been traditionally implemented with a focus on the upstream, the new technology R&D, and downstream, the market demand segments. So production tax credits and government loans have been available for clean energy developers and clean energy consumers. However, a heavy reliance on foreign suppliers and producers and shrinking domestic manufacturing capacity in the US has become a cause for concern. Even dating back to the Obama time, the US already started to impose trade remedies as a form of defensive green industrial policies on imported clean energy products, such as those coming from China and those coming from the Southeast Asia. So the trend of restricting trade definitely peaked during the Trump era. And now under the Biden's administration, you can identify that the US has been even more assertive in making use of aggressive green industrial policies in order to achieve multiple goals, such as boosting US domestic manufacturing, securing supply chain, and curbing China's influences. And in my paper, I listed a non-exhaustive number of such legislations like IIJA, Chips Science Act, and most notably the Inflation Reduction Act, and also a less Let's discuss one, the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And as you can see, those legislations definitely demonstrate the U.S. Pursuit of multi-purpose green industrial policies. And again, like China, it remains too early to tell whether the evolution of green industrial policies in the U.S. will yield substantial progress to achieve the underlying policy objectives. Now, next slide, please. Okay, so last case study in my presentation and also in the paper is the EU. So the EU, quite similar to the US, the traditional focus of the EU's green industrial policies have been holistic, horizontal, with a focus on promoting R&D and preserving a competitive internal market. So the European Union member states' autonomy in resorting to actually many different forms of green industrial policies has been quite limited in order to avoid market distortion, in order to preserve the integrated internal market. So similar problems that the US have been struggling with, such as the shrinking domestic manufacturing, such as the overdependence on foreign suppliers, also have occurred in the European Union. So therefore, those problems, it wasn't that problematic for the EU until in 2022, when the US passed and enacted the Inflation Reduction Act. You actually can see the very drastic and radical shift of the EU green industrial policies. And I just want to identify two examples: the legislative proposal of the Critical Raw Materials Act, the legislative proposal of the Net Zero Industry Act, because it's very rare for the EU to actually impose an explicit, specific targets for domestic sourcing. So for instance, the NZIA. Okay, I received a chat. Okay, so let me get back to, so actually the NIZ also sets a target of reaching a manufacturing capacity for those technologies equivalent to at least 40% of the EU's annual deployment needs by 2030. Although the reality is that the EU still remains deeply divided on whether they need a massive size stimulus package, just like the US, like the China, whether they would, or whether they are capable to compete on a dollar basis. So they are also struggling with what exactly going to be their green industrial policies in order to compete with the US, with China, and probably other emerging economies in the coming years or even decades. And similar to the US and China, it remains too early to tell whether the EU can be effective in achieving the transformation of its green industrial policies to fulfill the underlying purposes. Okay, next slide, please. I'd like to quickly go through the implications of the multi-purpose green industrial policies. A few points I would like to take from the paper. First is, it seems the proliferation of the multi-purpose green industrial policies is inevitable in this new era with intensified geopolitical, geoeconomic competition, especially among the largest economies. Therefore, the risk of using multi-purpose green industrial policies violating the rules-based multilateral trading system looms large. Due to time limits, I wouldn't be able to go through the detail. However, if you're interested, you can take a look at my working paper. Another point I want to draw is that the caution is still needed because some objectives are hard to reconcile, such as the industrial objective and the climate change mitigation objective. And I'm afraid in many cases, climate objectives can easily be compromised or even sacrificed. And last but not the least, I also want to bring out in this green industrial policy race among the world's largest economies, we tend to overlook the position of smaller economies that simply do not have large physical budget, that simply cannot compete on dollar-to-dollar basis. Can we also guarantee that fairness and equity in the low carbon energy transition will exist for those less financially capable and smaller sized economies in this transition? So, okay, I think I'm right on time, and here I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and listening.
Thank you so much, Mandy. And that is a very, very good timing. And thank you, be so concise, but still very informative about a very, I think, under-researched area in terms of the comparative study you have provided us and by comparing the major industry policies from the three major economies, which is much needed in the literature and the policy making as well. It's one of the challenges for the cooperation and globally and regionally is the lack of understanding of each other's policies and objectives, I would say. So thank you for doing that. And I think that actually provides a very good background and context for the second presentation, which will be given by Professor Brian Mercurio. And it's a good friend, and it's a frequent visitor to civil events. And thanks, Brian, for that. And Brian does not really need much introduction anymore, I would say, but still, I would just give him a brief introduction. Brian is a professor, a Simon Lee Professor of Law at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he specialized in international economic law, and his works focus on the intersection between trade law and intellectual property rights, free trade agreements, trade relations with China, trading services, and international investment law. He is a frequent consultant and advisor to governments, industry associations, law firms, on a wide range of trade and investment matters. And Brian's topic today is, as I said, it's quite well aligned with what Mandy has said about the broader picture about of the green transition and the industry policies. And his topic is the impacts of green industry policy. Brian, please take it over.
Great, thanks, Wei-Wan, and I will try to match the quality and punctuality of Professor Fong as well. If I get one out of the two, I'll be happy. This talk is based on, I should say, is part of a government grant from Hong Kong that I have called Engaging with China to Reform the World Trading System. I'm also obligated to say that's grant number 1460972. All right, I hope that's not the most interesting part of my talk. Thanks, Wei-Wan, again for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come back to UNSW in person or virtually. So my talk is going to be pretty general, and I think it does dovetail quite nicely with what Professor Fong spoke about. I will take a broad approach. So if we start with just the post-war international order, obviously it's been built on a model that promotes a common understanding and a rules-based system. So trade, investment, financial flows have been liberalized, while technological advancements allowed firms to construct the global supply chains we all know about based on cost and efficiency. Advanced and low and middle income countries all benefited from the system, became richer as the world grew accustomed really to large scale poverty reduction and improved health outcomes. Now, this is not to say that increased globalization over the past 70 years produced only winners. Obviously, on the contrary, there has been losers. Manufacturing jobs, for instance, in advanced economies departed with each new generation of technology and as manufacturing expanded in the global south. While the movement of jobs undoubtedly benefited the newly employed people in the global south, workers in developed countries really struggled to find comparative alternative employment. So there's a feeling, I think, in the West that the international order has not delivered all it's promised. This sentiment in part led to the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and Trump promoted, of course, an America First agenda that downplayed international cooperations, partnerships, the WTO, while also aggressively targeting China and its perceived unfair model of economic development. Now, in January 2020, the US and China agreed to a phase 1 trade deal, which ended the tariff escalations, but didn't remove the existing tariffs. And of course, shortly thereafter, we have the COVID-19 pandemic wreaking havoc around the world as governments struggled to keep their populations safe and their economies afloat. Supply chains broke down, shortages became commonplace. and governments that could spend dead spend. Now, inevitably, inflation set in and reversed several years of gains. And I go through this history that I think we all know, just to say simply that that was really, I think, the final straw in the liberalized, rules-based global world order for the time being. We have countries that have preached and practiced policies which loosely can be defined as embodying the Washington consensus, starting to pull back, right? Free and fair trade, no longer the mantra, as governments embrace industrial policy, protectionism, managed trade. Perhaps most surprising, of course, is the U.S. is engaging in this. The U.S. is adopted, what is called, I guess, a modern American industrial strategy. It really runs counter to traditional American views and norms. So if we look at this modern American industrial policy, we can see that throughout his presidency, Joe Biden has promised the renewal of the domestic economy. This is manifested in the prioritization of industrial policy as a means to restructure the economy, increase employment, maintain technological supremacy over China, and combat climate change. I think the notion, if we look, of greening appears frequently in statements and runs throughout the policy. Now, the undertone, of course, of the president's efforts is seemingly the need to seemingly contain a rising China. And I think at least it's my contention that the green industrial policy part of the US is really no more than a veneer to hide the real focus, which is China. So greenwashing, if we want to call it, often used at the corporate level, but let's use it at the country level as perhaps greenwashing at its finest. I think this is dangerous, destabilizing, and threatens the world trading system itself. So in doing so, the Biden administration is pushing back against obviously the long-standing trend of liberalized trade and investment, and instead embracing subsidies, trade distortion, state-led development. All, of course, are things in which the US has long criticized China for, and quite frankly, still criticizes China for. And these policies were laid out in, I think, most prominently and perhaps most eloquently in a rather hawkish speech in April by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who stated really quite clearly that the perceived failures of past policy choices that ignored geopolitics, rising inequality, and climate change in the pursuit of liberalized trade and economic growth. In addition, obviously, I think, again, most importantly, the dissemination or to the reversal, I guess, destruction in some ways of the US industrial base. So Sullivan outlined a new path forward, which focuses on US manufacturing and providing subsidies and support to favored industries. I mean, that is, the government's going to select winners and losers. At the same time, the US is going to placate friends, or is trying to placate friends, with what Sullivan says is creating a secure and sustainable economy in the face of economic and geopolitical realities. In essence, again, Sullivan's setting out this modern industrial strategy with a focus on national security. And I think we can read that as strategic competition with China. Now, as part of that, of course, is the public investment. And obviously part of that is, again, public investment in green issues. Now, I think we have to read Sullivan's speech together with other speeches given by, for instance, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, and later US Trade Rep Catherine Tai. Yellen, in particular, discusses the need for US and China to work together on urgent global challenges, while also stressing the increasing tension between the two powers, calls it really strategic competition, but also strategic engagement. And in doing so, what Yellen's trying to do is distinguish US policy from China's state capitalism model, which she says is more complex and ambitious. And in fact, she very clearly says seeks to obtain an unfair economic advantage over competitors. I think regardless of the stated justifications, it's pretty clear that the US is trending towards protectionism, managed trade, and using green to justify the move. So I think this is perhaps most evident in the acts, in one of the acts Professor Fogg mentioned, the Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite its name and its really poor IRA as a abbreviation, is aimed squarely at advancing the development of green technologies through subsidies, through tax breaks, through incentives to encourage production of electric vehicles and renewable energy components in the US. I think this is one of those areas where the US is attempting to run faster than China, but of course doing so at the cost of alienating allies, whereas the Chips and Science Act, for instance, is a model where the US is attempting to trip up China as it bans outsourcing to that country. So what are the implications here? And I think if we look at the implications of this new policy, of this populist economic nationalism and anti-China sentiment, obviously it's playing well domestically, but the inward focus has a wide range of economic and geopolitical implications. The first is that economics and its principles, such as comparative advantage, are no longer the priority. You know, where the prevailing view in Washington is de-risking or decoupling from China, deglobalizing and domesticating supply chains and rebuilding the manufacturing base. Here again, renewable energy, e-vehicles, these are used as a justification. And the justification is somehow, because we're going to say the word green, it makes industrial policies that have been shunned for decades as both uneconomical and inefficient now essential. Right, so we put it in the category of, you know, essentially national security to lead to this transformation and to make it acceptable to people who really quite generally would not find it acceptable at all. The second is that, of course, US measures are not occurring in isolation. They're going to be mimicked by other countries that also seek to ignore then fundamental economics and distort markets so as not to lose ground to the US. Indeed, Professor Fogg mentioned the EU efforts. Also, the UK, for instance, has announced plans to compete with the US on semiconductors, on green manufacturing. The risk here is obviously a subsidy battle. And the subsidy battle will benefit countries that can throw the most money at problems or at issues, but it's going to distort the market in really severe and unanticipated ways. Finally, while green motives are worthwhile if done in earnest, really, in order to have an effect, they must be done in tandem with other countries. The US is maybe half-heartedly attempting to do that, but not really offering countries much in return. For time, I think I'll just say, you know, while it's one thing for the administration to seek to make the US economy more green or resilient or sustainable and inclusive, it's quite another to want to force countries to do the same. And we see that with the Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, for instance, which is really asking countries to accept US standards on a number of things, including environment, but also worker rights, corruption, digital technologies, and they're not really offering anything in return, not offering market access, etc. And I have to wonder whether that is going to lead to success. So how has the world responded to this? And if we look through the world, this movement towards industrial policy and protection and managed trade, when combined with this newfound interest in the business community to diversify supply chains, coming off the back of increased risks. Now, whether that be US-China trade frictions that occurred prior to 2020, or obviously COVID, the change is happening, right? We have a rapidly changing trading environment. Even we can look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for instance, and now, you know, Israel-Hamas. So supply chains have faced disruptions for quite some time, and companies have mitigated this risk by port risk, for instance, diversifying to multiple ports, increased inventory to ensure stock, utilizing advanced technologies, and reformulating product mixes and ingredient lists to get around bottlenecks. But what this means is supply chains that have been built for speed, low cost, and innovation, these were all exposed, and really these are now out. Now, instead of just in time, we have just in case. And so companies are seeking more regional trade, nearshoring as a way to improve resilience and mitigate risks. Companies are increasingly engaging what's known now as a +1 model of manufacturing, with a manufacturing source in China for the Chinese market and other perhaps regional markets, while investing in redundant sourcing and manufacturing outside of China as a way to reduce the risk from trade friction and geopolitical tensions. And finally, there's been a shift in the regulatory landscape as environmental, social, and corporate governance, so ESG, really becomes more prominent. Reputational risk and the like are now really featuring in strategic thinking and planning. So with everything from human rights and the Uyghur Act that Professor Fong mentioned, to climate change mitigation, to sanctions, all being tracked and monitored. Supply process is more complicated now and more expensive. And as I say, this has led to this shift to just in case manufacturing. And this is gaining speed, and I'm not sure it's a good thing, but we have this de-risking movement, which started as a way to that the US would use really to try to reduce reliance on China. We have it, and for national security reasons, we have it now appearing in common speak. So WTO Director General Ngozi now speaks about re-globalization, which she says we have over-concentration of manufacturing in certain sectors, in certain countries. We need to build resilience. We can't be reliant on a few countries for a few products. I mean, this is the Director General of the WTO essentially endorsing this. We have the G7 meeting earlier this year using uncharacteristically strong language to endorse de-risking and diversification of supply chains. I'll just to conclude, I will say, I understand that I only have a minute left. I think for several months into the Biden presidency, it wasn't apparent whether he had a coherent strategy. I think it's pretty clear now he does. And this strategy is a pullback from globalization and the rules-based order. It is a prioritization of national security, and I would say also trying to be American workers, but it's certainly going to reshape international markets, global supply chains, and diplomatic engagements. If other economies follow, then we're going to lead down a path of subsidy-led protectionism. And what that means is it's really not good for developing countries because they will not be able to afford to go down that path. Certainly China, the EU, they're going to react accordingly. Trade patterns will further bifurcate because of this. And we might have a radically different trading climate, negatively impacting economic development. I think that we're in for a bumpy ride. I'll just conclude by saying we're in for a bumpy ride. Certainly, comparative advantage. David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage still holds true, but it's also certain that it's fallen out of fashion. Where it leads is an unknown. But I think I'm with most people to say that the next few years, while it may not be great, it's certainly going to be interesting. So I will conclude there. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Brian, for that very interesting talk, and it's very insightful and it covers lots of aspects of it. Actually expands on what Mandy has to say about the comparative kind of study of the industry policies, but kind of your talk has presented more kind of the impacts of these policies and how that actually could affect global supply chains, as well as how that de-risking or risk-based strategies would actually mean for less developed countries. So I'm sure that many of these aspects that you have talked about, implications or policies, would be picked up in the next talk. So let me just quickly introduce another very good friend and co-author, Professor James Lorison. And James is the director of the Australia-China Relations Institute at the University of Technology, Sydney. He has published numerously in both academic journals and media outlets as commentaries and on the Australia-China economic relationships. So his talk today focuses on a very specific area and nevertheless a very, very important area which I have great interest in as well, which is about critical minerals. And as I said, it's also reflects on or will reflect on what Brian has said about the supply chain issues and de-risking stuff. So the topic of James' talk is the inadequacies of a geopolitical frame in promoting resilient critical minerals supply chains. James, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Wei Huan. Hope I'm coming through loud and clear. Yeah, you're right. So this talk does home in on critical minerals. And I've also, as you see, modified the title a little bit there. The title now is clearer that it homes in on Australia and China. Look, I hope that's not too niche. I think China and Australia are actually two useful countries to examine here. Australia is obviously very prominent upstream when it comes to critical minerals, where China's prominent throughout the supply chain, but particularly downstream. And of course, Australia and China often find themselves, if not on the opposite side of the geopolitical divide, certainly with significant differences between them. So I hope the Australia-China context is illustrative of something broader. Let's go to the next slide. Since the new Australian government came to power in May 2022, it's clear that they've been continuing the approach of the former Morrison government of applying a geopolitical lens to the development of Australia's critical minerals sector. You can see our Treasurer in a speech he gave in November last year, saying that Australia would need to be, quote, more assertive about encouraging investment that clearly aligns with our national interest in the longer term. He went on to say in that speech that there was a risk of disruption of critical mineral supply chains, and he emphasised a concentration of activity in China. So it was pretty clear where our Treasurer was heading. Let's go to the next slide. In June this year, the Australian government released a critical minerals strategy, so a more formal document laying out its approach. This again emphasised wanting to build more resilient critical minerals supply chains. It emphasised international collaboration, but then it threw in this term that we would seek to increase investment from quote unquote like-minded partners. And when you read through this critical mineral strategy, you will not find China mentioned once. You will, however, find the UK, Japan, Korea, India, the EU, pretty much everyone else. So it's clear that the Australian government is looking at the development of this critical mineral sector in Australia with a geopolitical lens. Perhaps that's not the only lens, but it's clearly prominent. Okay, next, please. When it comes to industrial policy, which of course is the theme of this particular panel, you're seeing the Australian government certainly reach for industrial policy, recognising that it needs to intervene. Markets, according to the Australian government, won't bring about the outcomes that we want. And you're seeing them adopt two particular methods. One is incentivising the development of Australia's own domestic sector and also increased partnerships with our, geopolitically like-minded partners, such as those in the United States. For example, the Australian government now has a $6 billion fund that it's dishing out to various parties to bring certain projects to life in Australia, and also to, particularly when they involve international collaboration with those so-called like-minded partners. Okay, next, please. On the other hand, aside from incentivising particular partnerships, there have been some moves to simply block Chinese participation in Australia's critical mineral sector. There've been, for example, our Treasurer over the last 12 months has taken the relatively unusual step of intervening and blocking two proposed Chinese investments that relate to Australia's critical mineral sector, on the basis that he judged them not to be in Australia's national interest. It's a little unclear to me just from looking at these two particular examples, how generalizable they are. I don't have time to dig into the details of each of these today, but they were quite unusual proposals. So they were blocked. Like, I'm just making that point here, but how representative they are, I think in a large part still remains to be seen. Okay, next please. Certainly, when you move away from the government's critical minerals strategy and the industrial policy, its initiatives, it's embarking upon, whether that's incentivizing particular developments or blocking other developments, there is a cottage industry in Australia that is lobbying hard to see China locked out. Particularly prominent in that discussion is a think tank in Canberra called the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. They are actively participating in the Australian public debate, lobbying for a complete ban on Chinese investment in Australia's critical minerals sector. They say that if Chinese companies had some ownership of critical minerals projects in Australia, that would be, in their mind, a national security issue. So that's where the lobbying is heading. All right, next slide, please. And indeed, the combination of the hints that have been given in Australian government documents and then overlay that with some overt pretty extensive lobbying efforts to see China cut out of Australia's critical mineral sector, you already see commentary in Australia suggesting that the critical mineral sector here is actually now off limits to Chinese investment. That top left headline was, from memory, I think it was November last year. So even a year ago, victory was being proclaimed by those who would like to see China completely cut out of our critical minerals sector. All right, next slide, please. But I would suggest it's not so simple, and I think the jury is still out. Particularly, I think there's been a shift in Australian government rhetoric over the last 6 months. Just last month, for example, we had our Resources Minister, Madeleine King. She emphasised that Chinese investment proposals, the fact that an investment proposal was from China would not mean that it could not be approved. She said that Chinese investments would continue to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, just as they always have been, and investment proposals from other countries as well. And last week, we had our Trade Minister, Don Farrell, making the same comment. Indeed, he said that they would still be, Chinese investment would still be welcomed, and we welcomed it whether it's from the Europeans, the Japanese, the Koreans, the Singaporeans, the US, or China. So that or China is important, because 12 months ago, the or China was simply not there. Now it is once again. So the jury's out. All right, let's keep next slide. So, look, in the second half of this presentation, I just want to run through what I consider to be the deficiencies of viewing development of Australia's critical minerals sector solely or even predominantly through a geopolitical lens. Let me be clear that I do absolutely think there is a case or a place for a geopolitical lens, right? The fact that many critical mineral supply chains, there is a concentration of activity in China that does create risk. I'm not denying that in any sense, but I think we're going to come up short if we take that geopolitical zero-sum lens and use that lens only as the basis for weighing up public policy, including industrial policy initiatives in this space. The first thing to point out is just a basic fact. Chinese investment has not been able to lock up Australian supply of critical minerals. That top left, a picture of the top left of your screen, Greenbushes, is the world's largest lithium, raw lithium spodumene mine in the world. It accounts for about a quarter of global supply. The likes of ASPI described that as a Chinese-owned facility. Well, let's just be clear, that is just dead wrong. It's disinformation. A Chinese owner only holds 26% of the shareholding of that. In fact, an American company, Albemarle, controls 49%, and the balance is made up by an Australian company. And the output of that mine is distributed to the owners based on their shareholdings. So an American company is getting most of the output of that mine. They're sending it to China and we'll talk about why that's the case in a minute. But the point is that the Chinese investment in that mine has not locked up Australian supply for the Chinese market. Okay, let's go to the next one. The second thing is, as much as some people have an inclination for a geopolitical lens and to see everything through a zero-sum frame, economic reality can often intervene. People will say that Australia exports last year, Australia exported 97% of its lithium spodumene exports to China, and they'll say that that represents a horrible overdependency on the Chinese market. Well, it's not quite that simple, because if you look at the global lithium spodumene market, China accounts for 85% of global imports. So if we're not selling to China, sure, we could sell to the 15% of countries that remain, often in a different hemisphere on the other side of the world. But this is the economic and business reality that Australian mines, lithium mines, whether they're owned by Australian companies or American companies or Chinese companies, have to deal with. And I'd suggest that's why most of our lithium does go to China. Okay, next slide. The other mistake I often see being made is we just look at one side of the relationship. So people will say, well, 97% of our exports go to China. Clearly, that means Australia is over-dependent on China. Well, it's useful to reverse the frame and see how things look from China. If you're sitting in Beijing, you're pretty nervous. Why is that? Well, because 85% of China's lithium spodumene imports come from Australia. So, yeah, sure, I understand Australia needs to be concerned about resilient supply chains, but Beijing is also concerned about resilient supply chains. And I think it would be quite useful if both sides recognise that exposure doesn't translate one-to-one to risk, because in fact there is a mutual interdependence here, not a dependence by one side on the other. All right, next slide, please. The third problem, I think, with taking a geopolitical lens is it just completely misses the basic economic point that economic exchange is a positive sum, and that means that while China may present challenges in some areas, it is also quite a natural partner in other areas. And you see this from the development of Australia's own critical minerals sector. You know, a decade ago, Australia only had one lithium mine, one. Over the last decade, it's been largely through Chinese investment that has expanded the capacity, and that has also helped other lithium mines get up and expand their operations as well. So the reason why Australia now in 2023 is one of the world's major lithium exporters, accounting for about 50% of total global supply, if I remember rightly, that reflects a decade of Chinese investment in the past. And even when it comes to downstream activity, that photo on the right-hand screen is a picture of Australia's only operational lithium hydroxide facility. So this is moving downstream from the mine. Guess what? The only reason that exists is because of Chinese investment and Chinese technology as well. All right, next slide. This is the final point. I finished on this one. The other thing I think the geopolitical lens and national security commentators are really struggling with is accepting the reality of the global technology frontier in 2023. For so long, of course, the West, quote unquote, the West was at the technology frontier. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to critical mineral supply chains, the West is oftentimes not at the frontier, right? And this is certainly true when it comes to critical minerals and rare earths in particular. What you see in front of you, let me just focus on the right-hand side. These figures are actually coming from a report that was prepared for the US government, and it makes the point that in China today, there are over 12,000 full-time rare earth element researchers. They estimate in the United States there are only 100. Then you get to the commercial coalface of rare earth excavation and processing. They estimate that there's now 300,000 full-time Chinese workers in the commercial rare element sector. By comparison, in the United States, there's only 405, right? So it's all very well to talk about diversifying to our geopolitical friends, but it's a bit of a problem if they're not at the technology frontier. I mean, we can certainly diversify and work with second-rate partners if that's what we want to do, but I'd suggest that's mostly just shooting ourselves in the foot. So to summarise, this geopolitical lens is relevant. We need to factor it in, but we also need to take a more holistic view that embraces other lenses, such as economic lenses that are positive some, and recognise the potential for China to be a partner as well as a challenge. So Wei Huan, I will finish up there.
Thank you, James. That's a very informative speech, as always. And with all of the policy changes and the diplomatic relationship shifts, there has been some promising signs about how this may actually heading towards a more cooperative, I would say, initiative. But I'm sure there will be questions for you in the audience. Now, our next speaker, Associate Professor Michelle Lim. She will be talking about another very specific but super interesting and important topic, which I'll introduce in a minute. But let me just give Michelle a brief introduction. Michelle is an Associate Professor of Law at the School of Law, Singapore Management University, and her research is very interdisciplinary. Focuses on the law and governance of biodiversity. Among many of her senior roles in different forums, she is a deputy chair of the Biodiversity Law Specialist Group of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law. Michelle's topic today is a bridge over troubled waters with a question mark. Can and should environmental and economic law come together to realize the aspirations of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework? So I guess that's another very interesting aspect of this talk, which includes insights and discussions about the interaction between economic and environmental law from the perspective of a global biodiversity framework. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Wei Huan, and thank you also to Fionn and Hannah for such wonderful organisation. As Wei Huan has foreshadowed, the what of what I'm going to be talking about today is the business and economic targets of the newly concluded Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which sits under the Convention on Biological Diversity. But before I get to that, I'll start by talking about a few of the whys. Why does biodiversity matter? Why is nature important to us? But also importantly, why is this biodiversity lawyer sitting in an economic law conference? So importantly, thinking about how, as my title suggests, how do we bridge the important tools and developments that are occurring in economic law with what's also in many ways the invitation that's being extended from biodiversity law instruments such as the Global Biodiversity Framework to come together for the future of the human and more than human of our planet. And I'll also touch a little bit on the how, which also inviting all of your expertise here, because I am by no stretch of the imagination economic or trade lawyer. This is the first time I've ever participated in an economic law conference. So to the why. Nature is fundamentally important in its own right, and it also underpins food security, the air we breathe, fresh water, but also everything that makes life worth living. I don't want to live in a world with no red panda, with no koala or number. Do we only want to know these species as part of fairy tales? In my own hometown of Sarawak, the Bornean orangutan, which shares 97% of our DNA, is also critically endangered, such as each of the species that I've just listed earlier. And this echoes a trend that we're seeing globally. So I was part of the IPBES global assessment, and you'll see why it needs an acronym. IPBES stands for the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. In other words, it's like the IPCC, but for biodiversity. So I was part of the global assessment, which brings together the state of knowledge around the world of how is biodiversity doing, how are nature's contributions to people doing. And one of the key findings is not only that which I've highlighted already, how critically important biodiversity is to us in many, many different ways, but it's under threat like never before in human history. Unprecedented global biodiversity loss. And a key finding that's coming out of the IPBES global assessment is if we do not fundamentally change our economic and social systems, we risk losing, in my lifetime, more than 1 million species. This isn't individual plants and animals or fungi, but species being lost from the face of this planet. And an important conceptual framing that comes out of the IPBES global assessment is that of telecoupling. You may not have heard the term telecoupling before, but in fact, each of you actually spoke to components of telecoupling. So as the name tele suggests, it's occurring across long distances. The coupling is the idea that social, economic, and environmental systems are so interconnected, it makes no sense to think about them separately. So Brian spoke about globalization. Telecoupling recognizes globalization, but it also recognizes how our Earth systems are fundamentally interconnected. So the oceans are interconnected, the atmosphere is interconnected. Telecoupling says we need to think about each of these things together. In the context of biodiversity, what it means that is while previously, where you didn't have the flow of goods, the flow of information, the flow of people that we have today, that the loss of biodiversity could be considered something quite local or quite regional. But in our current context, thinking about all the things that you've been talking about already, supply chains, consumption and production from areas far, far away from where the impact is occurring, you've got biodiversity loss that needs to consider how things are happening in other parts of the world, the broader geopolitical context that has already been spoken about, and how this impacts on the diversity of life on Earth. And I suppose in many ways, this brings me to the why I'm here today, because you're already hearing about, one, how traditional environmental law doesn't have the tools or capacity to deal with how biodiversity is being lost today. So traditional environmental law, very broad brush approach, would say, let's regulate a particular development in a particular jurisdiction with local impacts. And very much perhaps a public law approach, and not appreciating or having the tools to address broader issues of supply chains, of trade, and a range of important private actors. However, perhaps my use of the word doesn't appreciate was a bit too harsh, because you're seeing this appreciation come through in global biodiversity instruments such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. And it's to that I'll now turn to emphasize the range of targets under the newly formed Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that deals specifically with issues of business and economics, and a range of things that all of you have already spoken about in your presentations. You may have heard of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and I'll use the acronym GBF. You may have heard of in the media how the GBF has been billed as the Paris Agreement for Biodiversity. If you're interested, I can go into the reasons why that's just wrong. It's not the Paris Agreement for Biodiversity, but the similarities are that it sits under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which came into being at the same time as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. However, compared to the more hard law and binding approaches, such as Paris, even though Paris is a hybrid binding, non-binding approach, the Convention on Biological Diversity has taken a much softer targets-based approach. And in this newest form of the plan of the convention, you have 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. And these include a range of targets, including one of the more well-known ones is the target of 30 by 30, that 30% of the world's surface is included in protected areas by 2030. But the number of targets relevant to all the things you've already started to talk about today include, in particular, targets 15, 16, 18, and 19. So target 15 states that states are to take legal, administrative, or policy measures to encourage and enable business, and in particular to ensure large and transnational companies and financial institutions disclose their risk. And they go into detail as to what that means, but it includes supply and value chains, and also provide information to consumers to promote sustainable consumption patterns, and also report on compliance with access and benefit sharing regulations under the convention. Target 16 is around sustainable consumption choices. And target 18 is about reducing harmful incentives by at least 500 billion a year. So in some ways, perhaps, James, what you were talking about are the harmful incentives that perhaps the convention seeks to reduce. There's also target 19 talking about financing, including, and they go into detail about financing, but also including leveraging private finance. So I imagine, hopefully, we can all see where, importantly, these links need to be made across the sectors, and a key goal of the Convention on Biological Diversity is to mainstream biodiversity issues into all other sectors, because, as we've just discussed, biodiversity is fundamentally important and underpins everything we do. So moving further into the how, under target 15, we've just talked about how target 15 is about disclosure for businesses. And so as an initiative of the convention, they've come together to talk about an acronym which you may have heard of before in another form. That is TNFD. So that's the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And you may have heard the term TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So building on the need for disclosure amongst companies, the Secretariat and the business community have released this task force report. And in there, you see a lot of the language which you perhaps don't hear about as much in the environmental law sphere, but I'm already hearing a lot of today. That is the language of risk. And the message very much targeted to the business community is the question of the risk of supply chains, cash flows, etc., etc. Now, this is where the question mark in my topic comes about, because if you look at the IPBES values assessment, and I'll talk about some of the key findings in the IPBES values assessment in a little bit, what you're seeing is this focus on risk in communicating to the business community, which leaves out the range of other critical values of nature. So the IPBES values assessment, one of the key messages coming out of that is trying to answer the question of why are we losing all these things which we see as being so important? Why are we losing nature? And one of the key messages is that it's because in the valuation of nature, there's been a prioritization of those values which can be traded in markets. In other words, the things that make nature important to us through forestry, through fishing, through the services that nature provides. And in doing so, it crowds out those other values, such as relational values, that nature is important because of how communities come together due to their stewardship values of nature. nature is also intrinsically important in its own right in ways that you cannot put a dollar value on. So while it's in some ways encouraging to see these two sectors come together for the issue of biodiversity, my concern is the perpetuation of the emphasis on particular economic values on biodiversity. So in many ways, my proposition is an ethical one rather than an economic one. You see in the task force report very much pushing the importance of the economic values of nature. But what if financial and economic instruments to deal with this greening of industrial policy, what if it actually conflicts with the other values of nature, that of the protection of biodiversity itself, but also the ways in which different communities interact with nature? And so to conclude, what I'm suggesting and hoping for is whether we can move in our shared communities of environmental and economic law, move from a discussion of risk to responsibility, such as through stewardship in corporate approaches, etc. And my time is up, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation.
Many thanks, Michelle, and thanks for all the speakers to keep your presentation very sharp on time, and that gives us about 24 minutes for Q&A, and I can see that a range of questions have come through from the Q&A, and so let me try to group most of the questions. I'm sure there are still questions coming in, but let me try to group the questions and keep the questions and the Q&A session running. I want to group these questions based on what I have read, the questions that have come in. The three kind of general questions I want to ask each of you to address. So instead of asking individual questions to each speakers, I will ask a general question for each of you to address. So there are three sets of questions, which I also try to kind of align with the theme of this panel, but also broadly with this conference. So the first question I want to ask each of you to address from specifically from the area of your presentation is about how the policy instruments of the strategies that each of you have actually talked about in respect of green policies, in respect of critical minerals, in respect of biodiversity. So how do you see the ongoing growth of industry policies or policy instruments in your own area may have caused or may potentially cause competition between the countries? Now, so for example, when James talked about critical minerals, pretty much the focus is on the different kind of measures adopted by different countries, right? Particularly Australia. But these policies may compete with each other, including the allies, right? Their policies can actually compete if they're actually trying to get the strategy to enhance access to critical mineral supplies in overseas markets, for example. So how would these policies that you have described may cause competition, confrontations even, and between the countries or economies, and how these policies may actually cause disruptions in the global economy, including global supply chains and international relations, to be frank. So if each of you can speak for about 3 minutes on this question, that'll be great. I'll start with Mandy, please.
Okay, thank you, Wei Huan, for your very insightful question. So I want to discuss a few points. First, I do think right now, given the intensified rivalry competition among EU, US, and China, it seems that they are or they have been engaging in a unnecessarily intensified competition to try to undercut each other, which in my assessment is not going to be that conducive for clean energy transition, because unnecessarily intensified competition is going to disrupt the global value chains that we have developed for the past decades that have successfully delivered economies of scale, efficiency that comes with low cost. So in that regard, I'm a bit concerned that by competing on a dollar-to-dollar basis, by engaging in the zero-sum game, it will undercut global value chains. However, in order to be a bit more optimistic, I think it would be good if those large economies can engage in a more race to the top competition, meaning that they will bring higher standards, they will bring better terms for international trade, for international investment in clean energy sector. I did use the EU as a case study to look at the EU standard setting as a form of green industrial policy. So for instance, the EU battery regulation, which aims to cover the entire life cycle of batteries, which can be great. And that would be a very aggressive, ambitious form of green industrial policy that aims to bring up the whole standards of making products that otherwise can be damaging to our environment, to biodiversity as well. So I think it really depends on the specific design and implementation of green industrial policy. At the current stage, we see a lot of disruption, we see a lot of detrimental impacts. Just hopefully in the coming years or decades, those big powers can change their mind and engage in a more benign and environmental friendly competition to bring higher standards instead of just undercut each other. That will lead to really unnecessary and wasteful use of their budget. So that's my answer. Thank you.
Brian?
Yeah, well, clearly I'm not a big fan. I think I made that clear in the presentation. Look, I think it's it's this game of industrial policy certainly will create winners, but it will raise costs, right? And we have to deal with that. When we diversify away from the most efficient producer in anything, whether we're talking about textiles or minerals, it's going to raise costs. Now, that may not be a bad thing. I mean, I think we actually do need some diversification. Let's be clear about that. I perhaps maybe too bearish, and I think supply chain should, it's an evolution that supply chains will not just focus on speed and efficiency and cost, but also take into account labor practices, ESG, etc. That's not a bad thing in and of itself, actually. But when it's done for protectionist reasons, I think that's the problem. This creation of competition, I feel is and really increased subsidies driving this competition is not going to produce a good outcome, like Mandy just said, and like others have said. And I think it's going to create a situation in where you're going to have haves and have-nots. The US can put 370 billion into something. The UK cannot, right? The UK subsidy was, I think, 22 million. How is 22 million going to compete with 370 billion? Right? The UK has to say, well, we're going to take a more laissez-faire market-oriented approach. Why? Because they have no alternative, right? And I'll just conclude, and I think this is where the US is mainly getting it wrong in trying to run faster, that's fine, and trying to trip China, okay. But the problem is how to deal with competitors, with allies. In part, you want to bring them along and you need them to compete, but in part, you're also America first. So what signal is that saying? And this is why, again, just the last point, when people posed a NATO for trade to counter, China's actions and coercion, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't work because at the end of the day, each country is going to take matters in their own interest for their own population, for their own employers, etc., for their own farmers, etc. So I think it really, more thinking is going to have to go into this by these by the other countries to get an actual coherent policy.
Thanks, Brian. James?
Well, first of all, well said, Brian. I was nodding my head furiously throughout that. Look, on some public policy initiatives, Wei Huan, I'm just plain sceptical about how much they can shift the dial. I mean, I noticed in the Q&A there was a few questions around the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. Now, I'm hugely skeptical. I mean, as someone said earlier, it doesn't offer anything, right? There's no market access, and at the same time, it's not binding. So it's not clear to me what it actually does do. It's not like I'm not against it. I'm not against Australia and Canberra and Washington signing some MOU on critical minerals cooperation. That's fine. I just don't think it's actually going to amount to much, particularly when it's stacked up against public policy initiatives that involve real dollars, such as the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, I feel very confident in saying that the net effect of the Inflation Reduction Act for Australia will be to hoover up and suck up global capital into the US economy, right? Rather than investments being, put on the ground in Western Australia or somewhere like that. And indeed, you've already got this happening right now. For example, the Australian mining company Lynas has just set up it's setting up a new rare earth processing facility in Texas. Well, why is that? Well, that's because the US government is giving Lynas big wads of cash. Ross Garnaut, many of you would know him. He's a very eminent Australian economist, particularly in the renewable space, and he describes the Inflation Reduction Act from an Australian perspective, quote, as he says, its protectionist character is bad news for Australia. I think he's right. Just a final comment. You're right, Brian. I mean, we've got an Inflation Reduction Act that, what is it, 370 billion. And the Australian government at the same time is making a big song and dance about the fact that we're putting up 6 billion. That's Australian dollars, by the way. So it's only about 4 billion US dollars. So 370 billion versus 4 billion. Joe Biden ultimately doesn't want US capital in Australia. He wants downstream manufacturing, providing American jobs on the ground in US states. And that's the fundamental problem that we're going to run up against. I'll stop there.
Thank you, James. Michelle?
I'll go to talk about Target 15 and Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, because I think Target 15 is disclosure is flat frame. I'm actually optimistic that nature-based financial disclosures will help in putting biodiversity on the map, so to speak, because climate, even when you hear about things such as green industrial policy, green policy, etc., often the focus is so much on climate. But the fact that biodiversity is a huge issue in its own right, the hope that TNFD, nature-related financial disclosures, will cause the economic community, investors and businesses to sit up and take notice of the base on which a lot of economic activity comes from. Now, in terms of conflict, the reason why I mentioned Target 19 in terms of finance, that I was going to say was, but actually is an enduring dialogue, if you like, between broadly categorized North and South within the Convention on Biological Diversity, recognizing not only historical but continued extractive practices from richer countries and the global South, where most of biodiversity still remains, raises the issue of the transfer of finance between countries. And the Global Biodiversity Framework arguably almost didn't go through because of this issue, and it remains to be seen how much transfer of finance, recognizing the continued transfer of labor and resources from the global south to the global also private finance will be channeled towards each of those issues. But the final point in terms of disruption, I would say, is in the Earth system itself. The collapsing of ecosystems will cause societal unrest as well as disrupting markets and economic issues. So I think not losing sight of the state of nature is an important issue for a range of reasons, but for economic ones as well.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks all of you for the answers to the first question. Now, given the time we have 10 minutes left, so let me just combine the second and the third question, which I wanted to ask. But essentially, just to make a comment on the second question, you may comment on my statements or what I have to say. But what I see it is, and also from the audience questions, is that we at the international level we have the World Trade Organization, and Michelle, in your area you have a different kind of collaborative framework. But essentially what we're saying is that we have binding rules, but not really enforceable or increasingly unenforceable, right? And then it provides a unclear, to say the least, picture about how the rules can be used to address the unilateral kind of race for industry policies. At the bilateral and the plurilateral levels, as James also alluded to, we have more increasingly, I think, aspirational rules, and that won't actually be enforceable by themselves. So this is my comments, but that leads to my question, which is what's about the future, right? So how we deal with these challenges at global, regional, and perhaps bilateral levels, and how these can be built into a framework that would actually work to address the challenges that you have identified, competition, confrontations, and disruptions for common interests, right? For example, supply chains and other common interests that we're trying to deal with. 2 minutes each of you, and I will still follow the order of presentation. Mandy, please.
Okay, thank you, Wei Huan. So regarding your question, I think you asked about the suitability or feasibility of the existing framework to address those new challenges and disruptions. So I do think that WTO seems to be more and more inadequate in handling those profound disruptions to the global supply chains. But as a firm supporter of the multilateral trading system, I do think it would be a shame that countries walk away from this great system. But some reforms should be made. And I do think it would be helpful, like if those large economies or those who share similar concerns and share similar capacities, they could form a smaller club. It could be like clean energy clubs, it could be climate clubs to specifically address those imminent problems, such as supply chain security, such as the deployment, development of clean energy technologies. Because right now, just only looking at the EU, the US, and China, the green industrial policies they have deployed so far have been so inconsistent with the WTO rules, different agreements on so many different levels. So that suggests the existing framework does appear to be a bit inadequate. So therefore, how to move forward and how to move beyond the current paralysis of the dispute settlement, in particular at the WTO, the appellate body system, is something I think worth thinking. But right now, I think the geopolitical situations doesn't suggest we have a promising way out of it. But I would keep my finger crossed that those countries that are vested with the capacity to save the planet also can find the determination to work collaboratively and to transition our economy to a low carbon one. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. I guess that a more fragmented system needs to be the suboptimal kind of approach towards. But let me hear your views, Brian.
Sure. Well, I'll echo what Mandy said. I also pick up on something that Michelle talked about. I mean, I'm a big believer that you can't address problems just by looking at your own discipline, right? So when we talk of trade, we can't just look of law or economics or politics. You have to look at it in more holistically. Same, you know, sometimes I think we try to address environmental problems, but just looking at it through a trade lens, it doesn't really work, right? We need to involve the wider community. Just something else, I mean, she picked up on was it's not just about about climate change, but there's many other issues. And I think we are captured by climate change, and quite frankly, in trade, that's really all we talk about as well. I'll just use an analogy to pharmaceuticals. I mean, it's like when we talk about developing country diseases and where money is going from the north, it's really all still HIV, malaria, and TB, and everything else gets ignored. And that's probably not a great approach. Now, just to go more directly to your question, again, I think we have things pulling in different directions. On the one hand, we do talk about about cooperation and about green and environment. But on the other hand, we have, of course, what the US is doing, but also like dating back from 2015, we have China saying, that we're going to be the leader in certain technologies. Well, how are you going to be the leader? In a large part, it's going to be subsidies. I mean, what needs to be done is countries need to take seriously an environmental agreement at the WTO. Countries need to, in trade agreements, take environmental goods lists seriously, negotiate them. But that being said, sometimes that runs counter to actual policy priorities in the country. I mean, agreeing to limits on subsidies, again, that are trade distortion. I mean, we have it in the WTO. It's just actually, it's taking it seriously now. Agreeing to reductions, banning fossil fuel subsidies, etc. I mean, these are issues that, I think we know some of what can be done to mitigate, not to alleviate, but to mitigate. But like Mandy, I think, the climate is not right for that. And, it will take serious trade-offs and quite frankly, a more friendly climate geopolitically for that to occur in the medium term.
Thanks, Brian. James?
Wei-Huan, you remember a few months ago, you and I published a book chapter where we argued that Australia's big economic exposure to trade exposure to China didn't translate one-to-one to risk because there were both legal and economic mitigations available. Now, what you're saying now is that those legal mitigations are struggling, and I think you're right. But the good news is the economic ones are still there, right? So if we're talking about resilient supply chains, then just an obvious point is that resilience is boosted by having multiple suppliers in multiple locations. Okay, so why? And China can be part of that. I guess that's my basic point. I mean, I would be encouraging more Chinese investment to build up Australia's critical mineral sector. I saw some US states are actually blocking Chinese investment in the American critical mineral supply chains, which just seems to me to be completely counterproductive for actually building system resilience. There's other economic mitigations as well. For example, if we're worried about China cutting off the supply of rare earths, processed rare earths, well, we can stockpile, right? There's a whole range, there's a suite of mitigations available to us, even if the legal ones are increasingly looking shaky.
Thanks, James, and thanks for providing us with the alternative and to see the promise inside of it. Michelle?
In my area, the current frameworks are clearly not working. We're losing biodiversity, as I mentioned, at rates we haven't seen in any time in history. And I think rather than tinkering around the edges, what is really needed is fundamental value change rather than problem shifting. So if you look at issues of climate, yes, we could look at those technologies that reduce issues of carbon, but then that shifts to issues of the impacts of mining and minerals. I think do less of it and to be able to sustain thriving lives when using much, much less of the planet. So that's not a specific tinkering with any particular instrument, but I do feel that there's a fundamental value change that is needed to change how we think about our relationships with the rest of the world. And I mean rest of the world, including those that are not human.
Thanks, Michelle. And despite it's not specific, but I think that's a great line to end this panel, because I do also think that we need to rethink about the values and how we actually fight for our common goods globally. So with that, please join me thanking our great panelists and presentations for this panel, and I hope that they have provided lots of food for thoughts. I encourage you to engage with them individually if you have follow-up questions and comments. And also thank you, audience, for your questions, and thanks for your participation.